If you walk through the sacred gardens of Lumbini today, you are standing on what is universally accepted as the exact starting point of one of the world's great religions, the undisputed birthplace of Siddhartha Gautama. Every textbook, every travel guide, and every official history agrees on this location. Millions of pilgrims travel to this World Heritage Site in southern Nepal, seeking a tangible connection to the physical reality of the historical Buddha. They gather around the sacred pool and the ancient brick foundations. They are told that the history here is completely settled, that the geographical coordinates of enlightenment begin right under their feet. But when you look past the modern monasteries and the deep devotion, you find that the foundation of this absolute certainty rests almost entirely on a single piece of ancient stone, the Ashoka Pillar. Discovered in 1896, it bears a clear ancient inscription declaring that here the Awakened One was born. For over a century, this pillar has served as the ultimate historical anchor, proving to the world that Lumbini is the true birthplace. But there is a quiet timeline problem buried in the earth, an anomaly that historians know about but rarely discuss with the public. Emperor Ashoka placed that massive sandstone pillar in the dirt roughly 3 centuries after the Buddha actually lived and died. 300 years. To put that gap in perspective, imagine trying to definitively pinpoint the exact cabin where a historical figure was born in the early 1700s today, but doing it without a single written birth record, property deed, or map. Imagine doing it relying entirely on centuries of shifting oral tradition. Ashoka was a brilliant ruler, but he was not an archaeologist. He was an emperor actively building a massive unified empire. He was a new convert to a religion that desperately needed a sacred physical geography to anchor its followers and legitimize his rule. This historical gap raises a profoundly uncomfortable question for anyone seeking the literal truth of the past. Did Ashoka's royal engineers actually find the authentic birthplace preserved perfectly by local memory for 3 centuries? Or did the emperor simply designate an existing sacred grove to serve as the official starting point for his new state religion? When we stop relying on the stone declarations of ancient kings and start looking closely at what modern shovels have actually pulled from the dirt, the official story splinters. In the next part of our investigation, we are going to examine the physical evidence. We are going to look at the conflicting excavation sites and the troubling carbon dates that challenge the very foundation of where the Buddhist story actually begins. The dirt beneath Lumbini has always held the answers, but it has been incredibly reluctant to give them up. Before we even look at the birthplace, we have to address the royal city where Siddhartha actually grew up, Kapilavastu. For decades, India and Nepal have fought a quiet archaeological Cold War over its true location. Is it Tilarakat in Nepal or Piprawa in India? Both sites have yielded massive ancient fortifications, and both claim to be the childhood home of the prince. But the most crucial battleground for the historical timeline is directly beneath the Maya Devi temple in Lumbini. In 2013, an international archaeological team led by Robin Conningham dug deeper under the temple than anyone had ever gone before. Below the brick structures built by Emperor Ashoka, they found something remarkable: the decayed remnants of ancient wooden post holes surrounding a central open space, a timber tree shrine. When they carbon dated the soil and charcoal fragments from these post holes, the dates pointed directly to the 6th century BCE. For the mainstream historical community, this was the smoking gun, a 6th century shrine perfectly aligned with the traditional dating of the Buddha's birth. The global headlines declared the mystery officially solved. But when you strip away the press releases, the actual archaeological data is much more ambiguous. Here is the specific detail that complicates the narrative. Tree shrines were not exclusively Buddhist. They were incredibly common across ancient South Asia as pre-Buddhist fertility sites dedicated to local tree spirits known as yakshas. The soil tells us that a sacred tree stood there and that a wooden fence was built around it in the 6th century. What the soil cannot tell us is who was worshipping at that tree. There is no definitive artifact from that lowest timber layer, no inscription, no unique Buddhist symbol that conclusively proves it was a Buddhist shrine rather than a generic local cult site that was later absorbed and rebranded by Ashoka's royal engineers. The evidence suggests this was a profoundly sacred space long before Ashoka arrived. But whether it was sacred because an awakened prince was actually born there, or simply because it was an ancient local shrine that made a convenient geographical anchor for a rapidly growing empire, remains fiercely debated in the academic shadows. What the dirt proves is that by the 3rd century before the Common Era, Lumbini was already a massive pilgrimage center. The foundations are real. Emperor Ashoka's investment is undeniable. But the connection between his grand imperial project and a wandering teacher who lived 3 centuries earlier remains a bridge built of faith, not archaeology. We cannot say with certainty that Ashoka found the exact birthplace. We can only say that he utilized a deeply sacred site to serve as the geographical anchor for his state religion. For those of us who grew up immersed in the Buddhist cultures of Southeast Asia, these places were never just history. They were the foundation of our spiritual reality. We grew up offering lotus flowers to images of the newborn prince taking his first steps. Discovering that the physical ground beneath that story might have been chosen by a political ruler rather than historical destiny can feel deeply destabilizing. Yet this archaeological reality reveals something necessary about the survival of early Buddhism. A philosophy centered entirely on impermanence is difficult to sustain across centuries. To survive the death of its founder and spread across a continent, the tradition needed roots. It needed a physical center of gravity. Ashoka understood that a vast empire requires maps, and a unified religion requires tangible coordinates. He gave a philosophy of mind a physical geography. The question we are left with is far larger than a dispute over ancient property lines. If the sacred geography of Lumbini was a later invention, constructed to protect a fragile tradition, does that physical fiction diminish the psychological truth of what the Buddha actually taught? This investigation continues. If you want to keep following the evidence with us, the Buddhist Enigma is where we ask the questions that deserve more than easy answers. Ask yourself if the ground is holy because a prince was born there, or if it became holy because millions of people desperately needed a place to stand.